The ocean looked endless long before it became a prison. For the men who stepped aboard a Portuguese caravel during the Age of Discovery, the voyage was never simply a journey toward unknown lands, but a slow surrender to hunger, fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty, where every sunrise offered hope, while every sunset reminded them that home was growing farther away. Before we continue, imagine yourself standing on that narrow wooden deck with nothing but dark water surrounding you. Would you still have chosen to sail if you knew what waited beyond the horizon? Europe's hunger for spices, wealth, and new trade routes pushed kingdoms toward the sea, transforming fragile wooden ships into the engines of one of history's greatest expansions. Portugal invested decades exploring the Atlantic coastline, searching for a passage that could bypass expensive overland routes controlled by powerful empires, while each successful expedition encouraged rulers to risk even more lives in pursuit of extraordinary rewards. Yet behind every celebrated navigator stood dozens of ordinary sailors whose names disappeared from history almost as quickly as the waves erased their wake. Those sailors rarely dreamed of glory because survival itself was already an overwhelming ambition. Many came from villages where poverty offered little future, while others were recruited under pressure, leaving familiar shores with no certainty that they would ever return. And as the coastline slowly vanished behind them, another realization settled into their minds. From that moment onward, the sea would decide everything. The ship itself offered little comfort, even before the first storm appeared on the horizon. A typical Portuguese caravel stretched only a few dozen meters from bow to stern, forcing dozens of men to share a cramped wooden world where every movement, every meal, and every restless night unfolded within the same confined space, making privacy something they quickly forgot had ever existed. How long could a person endure such confinement before the endless rhythm of the sea began to reshape both body and mind? Everything below the deck revolved around necessity rather than comfort. Barrels of water, salted meat, dried biscuits, ropes, tools, and valuable cargo competed for every available corner, leaving sailors to sleep wherever they could find enough room to lie down, often squeezed between supplies that shifted with every wave, while stale air and damp timber surrounded them without relief. As each passing week consumed another portion of their provisions, the realization became impossible to ignore that every meal brought them one step closer to scarcity. The ocean showed no interest in human plans or ambitions, and once the coastline disappeared beyond the horizon, there was no rescue waiting beyond the next wave. Every decision made by the captain, every adjustment of the sails, and every change in the wind carried consequences that could determine whether the expedition returned with unimaginable wealth or vanished forever into waters that would never reveal what had happened. The crew itself reflected the harsh realities of the world they had left behind rather than the heroic legends that would later celebrate these voyages. Experienced seamen stood beside frightened teenagers learning the trade for the first time, while young boys carried out the smallest duties under constant pressure, each hoping that obedience and endurance might keep them alive long enough to see another sunrise. But in a place where every mistake could endanger the entire ship, how much mercy could anyone truly expect? Life aboard followed a rigid chain of command that allowed little room for argument or hesitation. The captain ruled with nearly unquestioned authority. The pilot guarded the knowledge that kept the vessel on course, and every order flowed downward through officers until it reached the ordinary sailors, who understood that discipline was enforced not simply through respect, but through punishment severe enough to discourage even the smallest act of defiance. In the middle of an unforgiving ocean, obedience often became the only barrier separating order from complete disaster. Beyond the sailors, every expedition depended on a handful of specialists whose work rarely attracted attention but often determined whether the voyage continued at all. Ship carpenters struggled to keep the wooden hull intact. Caulkers sealed every crack that threatened to admit the sea. Barber surgeons fought injuries with painfully limited knowledge, and chaplains offered prayers that comforted frightened crews when no practical solution remained, reminding everyone on board that survival depended as much on hope as on skill. The men who signed on for these voyages rarely imagined how quickly the sea would strip away every certainty they had ever known. Skilled mariners carried years of hard-earned experience, while farm workers, laborers, and desperate young recruits stepped aboard with little understanding of the trials ahead, discovering almost immediately that courage alone meant very little against the endless demands of the ocean. If each voyage promised fortune to a fortunate few, why were so many willing to gamble their lives for rewards they might never live long enough to claim? Young cabin boys occupied the lowest place within this floating society, performing the simplest tasks while enduring the greatest hardships. They turned the sandglasses that measured every watch, carried messages between officers, cleaned filthy decks, and served meals to men who outranked them, all while growing accustomed to exhaustion, punishment, and responsibilities far beyond their years. Childhood faded quickly aboard a caravel, replaced by lessons that no ordinary life on land could ever have taught. Every person on board depended on the others in ways that extended far beyond rank or authority. The navigator watched the heavens for guidance. The carpenter listened for the ominous sounds of strained timber. The caulker searched tirelessly for leaks before they became disasters, and the barber surgeon prepared for injuries that were not a question of if, but when, because on a ship surrounded by thousands of miles of open water, even the smallest weakness could slowly become a catastrophe waiting to unfold. The caravels themselves were remarkable achievements for their time, yet they were built for endurance rather than comfort. Barely large enough to carry their crew, supplies, and valuable cargo, these vessels forced every man to live within a world of creaking timber, damp air, and endless motion, where the horizon remained the only constant and solid ground became nothing more than a fading memory. How would your mind endure if every day began and ended surrounded by nothing except the sound of waves striking the hull? Below the deck, darkness swallowed nearly every corner of the ship. Food stores, barrels of drinking water, tools, spare equipment, and commercial goods filled the cramped interior so completely that sailors squeezed themselves into whatever empty space remained, sleeping beside cargo while stale air, moisture, and the smell of decaying wood clung to every breath they took. The deeper the voyage carried them into the ocean, the more that narrow, floating world seemed to close in around them. Even the simplest necessities became constant challenges inside such confined conditions. Fresh water rested inside wooden casks that slowly spoiled over time. Food had to survive months without refrigeration, and every object aboard demanded careful attention, because replacing a broken tool or a damaged supply was impossible once the coastline had disappeared, leaving the crew increasingly aware that every passing day reduced the margin between survival and disaster. The sleeping quarters could hardly be called quarters at all. Most sailors owned no bunk and no private corner, stretching out wherever space allowed between barrels, coils of rope, or stacks of provisions, while only the captain and a handful of senior officers enjoyed tiny cabins that offered little more than a narrow bed and a small chest for their belongings. As night settled over the Atlantic, the ship never truly rested, because the sea refused to grant silence or stillness to anyone aboard. Preparing a hot meal depended entirely on the weather's mercy. A small cooking area could only be used when the sea remained calm enough to keep the fire under control, forcing the crew to survive on hard biscuits, salted meat, and cold rations whenever storms or strong winds made open flames too dangerous, until eating became less about satisfaction and more about finding enough strength to face another exhausting watch. How long could the human body continue working under such conditions before fatigue became more dangerous than the ocean itself? Even the most ordinary aspects of daily life revealed how unforgiving existence at sea had become. There were no proper sanitary facilities, little opportunity for privacy, and almost no escape from dampness, foul odors, and constant discomfort, leaving every sailor to accept that dignity slowly disappeared alongside the coastline, while each new sunrise reminded them that the hardest part of the voyage might still lie somewhere beyond the next horizon. The order that governed life aboard extended far beyond the chain of command. Every hour was measured with precision. Every watch began with the sound of bells and the turning of sandglasses, and every sailor knew exactly when to climb the rigging, inspect the sails, stand lookout, or grab a few precious moments of rest before duty called again, because hesitation at sea could place the entire expedition in danger. Could anyone truly become accustomed to a life where even sleep arrived only in short fragments, constantly interrupted by the demands of the ship? The crew worked in rotating watches that continued through daylight and darkness without interruption. While one group adjusted sails, steered the vessel, or scanned the horizon for hidden dangers, another tried to recover its strength wherever there was enough space to lie down. Yet the endless cycle of labor, broken sleep, and physical strain slowly exhausted even the strongest men, leaving fatigue as a silent companion that never abandoned the voyage. Keeping the ship alive required relentless effort that most people on land would never imagine. Sailors climbed towering masts to secure heavy canvas against shifting winds, repaired worn ropes before they snapped under pressure, sealed leaks before seawater flooded the hull, and operated the bilge pumps hour after hour whenever water collected below deck, knowing that neglecting even the smallest task for a single moment could allow the sea to claim the vessel without warning. Meals offered the only brief interruption to the endless rhythm of work, though they were hardly moments of comfort. Around midday, when the weather allowed a fire to burn safely, the crew gathered for a simple ration before returning almost immediately to their duties, eating quickly from shared pots while knowing that the next order could come before the final bite was swallowed. What did food mean anymore when every meal served only to postpone exhaustion rather than satisfy hunger? Faith became as essential as rope and timber during these endless crossings. At dawn and again before nightfall, prayers echoed across the deck, and whenever conditions permitted, the chaplain gathered the crew for religious services that reminded frightened men their fate rested in hands greater than their own, offering comfort in a world where storms, disease, and unseen dangers could erase an entire expedition without warning. When work finally eased, the rare moments of quiet became treasures beyond measure. Some sailors repaired worn clothing or carved small pieces of wood to keep their hands occupied. Others exchanged stories of distant homes or watched the horizon disappear into the fading light, clinging to familiar voices and simple routines because they understood that preserving hope was sometimes just as important as keeping the ship itself afloat. Navigation across the open ocean demanded far more than courage, because once land disappeared beyond the horizon, there were no landmarks to guide the voyage. Every successful expedition depended on a handful of highly trained pilots who combined mathematics, astronomy, experience, and careful observation, transforming the sky itself into a map that could lead fragile wooden ships across thousands of miles of empty sea. How could anyone hope to find a distant coastline when every direction looked exactly the same day after day? At noon, the position of the sun became one of the navigator's most valuable guides. Using simple instruments such as the mariner's astrolabe or the quadrant, the pilot measured the height of the sun above the horizon and compared those observations with astronomical tables, allowing him to estimate the ship's latitude with surprising accuracy whenever clear skies cooperated, although clouds or heavy storms could instantly deprive the crew of their most reliable reference. Longitude remained an entirely different challenge, forcing navigators to rely on experience rather than certainty. They carefully recorded compass headings, estimated the vessel's speed, noted the influence of winds and currents, and filled their logbooks with constant observations, knowing that even a small error repeated over weeks at sea could carry the expedition hundreds of miles away from its intended destination before anyone realized how far they had drifted. Experienced navigators also learned to read the sea in ways no instrument could fully explain. The shape of the waves, the flight of seabirds, subtle changes in the color of the water, and even the scent carried by the wind often revealed clues invisible to less experienced eyes, allowing seasoned pilots to sense the approach of land long before it appeared above the horizon. Yet even with all that knowledge, could human skill ever truly overcome the vast uncertainty of the open ocean? Nature constantly reminded the crew that no amount of preparation guaranteed survival. Powerful Atlantic storms could rise with terrifying speed, surrounding the ship with towering waves and violent winds that transformed an ordinary day into a desperate struggle, while every sailor rushed to shorten the sails and secure the rigging before the sea tore the vessel apart piece by piece. Inside the battered caravel, every moment became a battle against chaos itself. Water poured through every opening, the hull groaned under immense pressure. Exhausted men worked the pumps without pause as loose objects crashed across the deck, and prayers blended with the roar of the wind because everyone aboard understood that if the ship surrendered to the storm, the ocean would leave no trace that they had ever existed. When the winds finally exhausted themselves, another threat often emerged from the silence. Days without a single breeze left the Caravels stranded beneath an unforgiving sun, where the sails hung motionless above the deck and the sea became an endless mirror that refused to carry the ship even a single mile closer to its destination. Which fate would have seemed worse to those sailors, the violence of a raging storm or the hopeless stillness of an ocean that refused to move? As the days of calm stretched into weeks, every calculation made before departure began to fail. Drinking water had to be rationed more severely, food spoiled beneath the relentless heat, and tempers slowly unraveled as exhausted men watched the horizon remain exactly the same from dawn until nightfall, realizing that their supplies continued to disappear even though the voyage itself had barely advanced. Invisible currents added another layer of uncertainty to every expedition. A crew could believe it had sailed steadily toward its goal for many days, only to discover through careful observations that powerful flows beneath the surface had quietly pushed the vessel far off course, proving once again that the greatest dangers were not always the ones the sailors could actually see. Not every danger announced itself with dark clouds or crashing waves. Thick banks of fog could drift across the ocean without warning, swallowing the horizon until sea and sky merged into a single wall of gray, leaving the crew unable to judge distance or direction, while every unseen sound raised the fear that another vessel or hidden shoreline might be dangerously close. How many disasters began not with violence, but with the simple inability to see what lay only a short distance ahead? Night brought its own challenges, replacing familiar landmarks with a sky filled with stars that served as both guide and reminder of the vast emptiness surrounding the ship. Experienced pilots searched the heavens for constellations they had memorized through years of practice, while ordinary sailors stared into the darkness, knowing that beyond the faint glow of their lanterns stretched an ocean so immense that a single mistake could condemn every soul aboard without anyone on land ever learning their fate. Even when the sea appeared calm, the voyage demanded constant vigilance from everyone on board. Lookouts remained at their posts for hours, scanning the horizon for reefs, floating debris, or the first outline of distant land, because every successful crossing depended not on a single heroic moment, but on thousands of careful decisions made day after day, each one preventing a disaster that might otherwise have ended the expedition before its destination was ever reached. The voyage tested far more than strength or skill, because the greatest enemy often lived inside the human body itself. Weeks turned into months without fresh food, clean water grew increasingly scarce, and wounds that seemed insignificant on the day they appeared could slowly become life-threatening, leaving the crew to discover that survival depended just as much on resisting disease as on overcoming the sea. If the ocean could not defeat them, would illness succeed where storms had failed? Among the most feared afflictions was scurvy, a disease few sailors understood, but many came to recognize with dreadful certainty. Gums swelled and bled without warning. Teeth loosened until they fell away. Old scars reopened as though time itself had reversed, and growing weakness spread through the body until even the simplest tasks became overwhelming, while the true cause remained unknown to those who watched helplessly as their companions faded day after day. Medical care offered only limited hope against suffering that seemed impossible to control. The ship's barber surgeon relied on simple instruments, herbal remedies, and experience gathered through countless voyages, treating broken bones, infected wounds, and severe injuries with whatever supplies remained aboard. Yet everyone understood that once disease gained the upper hand in the isolation of the open ocean, faith and endurance often became the only medicines still available. Illness rarely struck only one man at a time. In the cramped darkness below deck, where damp air lingered and clean conditions were almost impossible to maintain, sickness could spread quietly from sailor to sailor until entire sections of the crew were weakened, forcing those who remained healthy to shoulder even heavier workloads as the voyage pressed relentlessly onward. How could a ship continue crossing the ocean when the very men responsible for keeping it alive were slowly losing the strength to stand? Infections turned even the smallest injuries into dangerous threats. A splinter driven deep into a hand, a cut from a rope pulled too quickly, or a fall against the rough timber of the deck could become increasingly severe without proper treatment, while limited supplies and months away from land left the barber surgeon struggling to preserve lives with little more than practical experience, crude instruments, and determination. Every successful recovery felt like a small victory, but every loss reminded the crew how fragile survival truly was. Death eventually became a reality that no expedition could completely escape. When a sailor's struggle came to an end, his companions gathered for a brief prayer before committing his body to the sea, watching the waves close silently above him as the ship continued its course without pause, leaving those still alive to confront a difficult truth that accompanied every mile of the journey. Tomorrow, the ocean might demand another name. The loss of a shipmate left a silence that lingered long after the ceremony had ended. There was no cemetery, no stone to mark a life. Only a weighted shroud slipping beneath the waves as whispered prayers disappeared into the wind, while the crew stood motionless for a few brief moments before returning to the duties that could not wait, carrying the memory of another companion who would never again answer the call to work. How many times could a sailor witness such farewells before accepting that his own might come just as quietly? Fear became an invisible passenger that never stepped ashore. It revealed itself in restless nights, in long glances toward dark horizons, and in the uneasy silence that settled across the deck whenever unfamiliar sails appeared in the distance, because every unknown vessel forced the crew to wonder whether they had encountered fellow explorers, hostile rivals, or pirates willing to kill for cargo, supplies, and prisoners. Yet the ocean tested the human spirit as relentlessly as it challenged the body. Every sunrise demanded renewed determination. Every successful repair strengthened fragile confidence. And every mile gained against the vast Atlantic reminded the crew that survival depended not upon a single act of courage, but upon countless small decisions to keep working, keep believing, and keep sailing toward a destination that still remained hidden beyond the endless horizon. Months at sea slowly transformed the sailor's understanding of time itself. The familiar rhythm of seasons, festivals, and ordinary life disappeared, replaced by the endless repetition of watches, changing winds, and uncertain horizons, until many could no longer measure their journey by weeks or months, but only by storms survived, supplies consumed, and companions lost along the way. What happens to a person's sense of reality when every day seems almost identical to the one before it? Memories of home became both a source of comfort and a quiet form of suffering. During rare moments of rest, conversations often turned toward distant families, familiar villages, and simple routines that had once seemed ordinary but now felt almost unimaginable, while every story shared among the crew reminded them of the uncertain promise that one day they might see those places again, or never return at all. Even so, the expedition could never afford to surrender to despair. Every morning demanded fresh determination as the sails were raised once more, the course carefully checked, and another stretch of open ocean faced with the same resolve that had carried them this far, proving that the greatest victories of these remarkable voyages were often not the discoveries recorded on maps, but the quiet courage required to continue sailing when every instinct urged them to turn back. As the weeks stretched into months, small signs began to suggest that the voyage was entering a new stage. Floating branches drifted past the hull, unfamiliar birds circled overhead for longer than before, and patches of seaweed appeared where only open water had existed for countless days, encouraging weary sailors to believe that land might finally be closer than anyone had dared to hope. Could these fragile clues truly mark the end of their ordeal, or would they prove to be another cruel promise made by the ocean? The excitement spread quietly through the crew, yet experience urged caution instead of celebration. Many expeditions had mistaken distant clouds for mountains or imagined coastlines where none existed. So the officers continued their observations with disciplined patience while every sailor strained his eyes toward the horizon, refusing to abandon hope even after disappointment had visited them more than once before. Then, At last, the long-awaited cry echoed across the deck, breaking months of tension in a single unforgettable moment. A lookout high above the sea caught sight of land in the distance, and for an instant the exhaustion, hunger, fear, and uncertainty that had defined the voyage gave way to overwhelming relief, as every pair of eyes turned toward the same narrow strip of coastline that had existed only in dreams throughout the endless crossing. The first sight of land did not mean the hardships were over, but it gave every exhausted sailor a reason to keep moving. Anchors still had to be lowered, sails carefully managed, and unfamiliar coastlines approached with caution, because hidden reefs, powerful tides, and uncertain waters could destroy a ship only moments before its long journey reached its destination. After surviving months of relentless danger, could disaster still be waiting within sight of safety itself? Stepping onto solid ground felt almost unreal to men who had spent countless weeks beneath an endlessly shifting deck. Legs weakened by the constant motion struggled to adjust to stillness. Fresh water tasted unlike anything they had remembered, and the simple feeling of standing without the sea beneath their feet reminded them how completely the voyage had transformed both their bodies and their minds. Yet for many sailors, there was little time to celebrate what they had endured. Cargo had to be unloaded, ships repaired, supplies gathered for the return crossing, and preparations immediately began for another passage across the same unforgiving ocean, proving that the age of discovery was built not only upon famous captains and remarkable maps, but upon ordinary men whose courage was tested every single day far beyond the edge of the known world. The voyage home was often every bit as dangerous as the journey that had carried the expedition across the ocean. Supplies were no longer abundant. Many crew members remained weakened by months of hardship, and the ship itself bore the scars of relentless storms and constant repairs, forcing everyone aboard to face the sea once again with bodies already worn to their limits. If reaching a distant shore demanded extraordinary endurance, what strength remained for the equally unforgiving return across the Atlantic? The ocean offered no reward for past victories, treating every crossing as though it were the first. Familiar routes could still be interrupted by violent weather, shifting currents, or long periods without favorable winds, while each damaged sail, cracked spar, or leaking plank reminded the crew that survival depended upon the same discipline and determination that had carried them through the first half of their expedition. Success was never guaranteed until the coastline of home finally appeared on the horizon. For those fortunate enough to return, the voyage remained with them long after they stepped ashore. The endless sound of waves, the strain of hauling heavy rigging, the memory of companions left beneath the sea, and the countless days spent surrounded by nothing but water became experiences impossible to forget, shaping generations of sailors whose quiet sacrifices made the great maritime discoveries possible, even though history remembered only a handful of the names that stood upon the quarterdeck. Not every expedition ended in triumph, and many never returned at all. Some vanished into storms that left no survivors to tell their story. Others disappeared after sailing beyond the last known horizon, leaving families to wait for years without ever learning whether their loved ones had reached distant shores or become another forgotten part of the Atlantic's countless secrets. How many remarkable journeys were erased so completely that even history could preserve nothing more than a name written in an old ledger. Despite those losses, the determination to explore never disappeared. Each successful voyage expanded the maps of the known world, opened new commercial routes, and encouraged future expeditions to push even farther into unknown waters. While the lessons learned through hardship gradually improved navigation, shipbuilding, and the knowledge that allowed later generations to sail with greater confidence than those courageous pioneers who had first faced the open ocean. Today, the great captains of the Age of Discovery are remembered in monuments, paintings, and history books. Yet the true story of those remarkable expeditions belongs just as much to the ordinary sailors who hauled the ropes, endured the storms, buried their companions at sea, and continued forward despite overwhelming fear. Their names may have faded with time, but their endurance carried fragile wooden caravels across oceans once believed impossible to cross, forever changing the course of human history. The legacy of those sailors extends far beyond the discoveries marked on old charts. because every new route across the Atlantic was purchased through endurance that few people today can truly imagine. Behind every celebrated voyage stood countless anonymous men who accepted relentless labor, disease, hunger, violent storms, and the constant possibility of never seeing home again, proving that history is often carried forward not only by famous leaders, but by ordinary individuals willing to face extraordinary hardship. But after hearing what life aboard those fragile caravels was really like, would you have found the courage to step onto one of those ships, knowing that the sea might become both your greatest challenge and your final resting place? The age of discovery transformed continents, connected distant civilizations, and reshaped the course of world history. Yet its greatest achievements were built one exhausting day at a time upon the decks of small wooden vessels crossing oceans that remained almost completely unknown. Every sail raised against the wind, every leak repaired in the darkness below deck, every prayer whispered during another violent storm, and every difficult decision made beneath unfamiliar stars contributed to journeys that forever changed humanity's understanding of the world, even if the men responsible for those sacrifices rarely received the recognition they deserved. Although centuries have passed since those remarkable expeditions first ventured beyond the edge of the known world, their stories continue to remind us of what determination, resilience, and hope can accomplish when tested under the harshest imaginable conditions. The waves that once carried the caravels have long since erased the footprints of those who sailed upon them. Yet the courage they displayed still echoes across history, inviting every new generation to remember that some of the greatest chapters ever written began with ordinary people willing to face an endless horizon without knowing whether they would ever return. The men who sailed those fragile caravels could never have imagined that centuries later their struggles would still capture the world's imagination. Their victories were measured not only by reaching distant ports, but by surviving another freezing night, enduring another violent storm, or finding the strength to climb the rigging after days without proper rest, reminding us that the greatest adventures in history were often built upon countless moments of quiet perseverance rather than spectacular acts of heroism. But what did those endless months at sea truly reveal about the people who endured them? And why do their experiences continue to resonate, even in an age when oceans can be crossed in hours instead of seasons? Perhaps the answer lies in the remarkable resilience that defined every ordinary sailor aboard those wooden ships. Faced with uncertainty that stretched beyond every horizon, they continued raising the sails, repairing damaged hulls, trusting unfamiliar stars, and confronting dangers they could neither predict nor fully understand, proving that the human spirit often grows strongest when every familiar certainty has been left far behind. Their journeys remind us that exploration has never belonged solely to kings, admirals, or celebrated captains, but also to the countless forgotten individuals whose determination carried history forward one difficult day at a time. The Atlantic has long since reclaimed the wakes of those caravels, erasing every visible trace of their passage. Yet the stories born upon those restless waters continue to endure. Every weathered plank, every prayer whispered beneath storm-darkened skies, every farewell offered to a fallen companion, and every hopeful glance toward a distant horizon became part of a legacy that forever transformed the relationship between humanity and the sea, leaving behind a timeless reminder that the greatest discoveries often begin with the courage to sail toward an unknown horizon from which there is no promise of return. Even after returning to familiar shores, many sailors found that the sea had become impossible to leave behind. The creaking of wooden beams echoed in their memories. Ordinary silence felt strangely unfamiliar after months of wind and crashing waves, and the steady ground beneath their feet seemed almost unnatural compared to the constant motion that had shaped every hour of their lives. Had the voyage truly ended, or had it simply become a part of who they would remain for the rest of their lives? The experiences carried home by these crews gradually transformed maritime knowledge throughout Europe. Every successful crossing revealed new currents, safer anchorages, seasonal wind patterns, and practical lessons that future expeditions would depend upon, allowing each generation of navigators to build upon the sacrifices of those who had ventured into the unknown before them. Progress was written not only on maps, but also in the hard-earned experience of ordinary seamen whose names were rarely preserved. Looking back across the centuries, it is easy to admire the remarkable achievements of the Age of Discovery while forgetting the human cost hidden behind them. Every distant coastline reached, every new trade route established, and every chapter added to the history of exploration rested upon thousands of quiet acts of endurance performed by sailors who accepted uncertainty as part of everyday life, leaving behind a legacy that continues to remind us that history is often shaped by those whose stories were almost forgotten.